Hello everyone, welcome to week 4. This week we are going to be talking about our first sort of substantive theory. We've already done egoism and relativism, which were kind of very minimalist theories. But with Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, we explore our first more detailed theory, which is a version of virtue theory. Just before we get going here, I apologize for the noise in the background. It's my bird. He is a bit noisy. Sorry about that. So before we go ahead and jump into Aristotle, a little bit of background on virtue theory in general. Aristotle is often considered one of the earliest proponents of virtue theory. He's an ancient Greek philosopher and student of Plato. However, he is not the only proponent of virtue theory. There are many other philosophers who accept various forms of virtue theory even today. The general idea for virtue theory is that morality is about character, right? So instead of being focused on trying to determine which actions are right or wrong, moral or immoral, the virtue theorist is concerned with how we develop a moral character, with the idea that moral action will follow from moral character, right? Aristotle is seen as one of the earlier proponents of this theory because he takes it a bit further and in a different direction from his teacher Plato, who discusses virtue in many of his works but doesn't have a work that is entirely devoted to ethics the way that Aristotle does. The main sort of ethical idea that you get from Plato is kind of adapted into this famous phrase, to know the good is to do the good. The idea here is that if only you know what the right thing is, you won't be able to help but do it. Right? It is impossible to knowingly do evil, is Plato's idea. Aristotle doesn't quite agree with that, but he does take from that the notion that virtue or morality is a function of the human being, their character, their understanding, rather than a function of sort of a list of rules or principles, right? So as I said, for Aristotle, as with all virtue theorists, the focus is on character. And a moral character will necessarily lead to moral action, according to Aristotle. So let's kind of go here through the first 3 books of Nicomachean Ethics, several sections of which you guys read for this week. And then the next PowerPoint for week 5 will be about the remaining sections of the Nicomachean Ethics in Rachel's article. So here in the first book of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle's focus is on trying to determine what the good is for the human being, right? So he says, the good has rightly been declared to be that at which all things aim. The idea here is that everything that exists is moving as it can towards its good. This is especially the case for conscious beings like human beings, which are actively seeking their good. Everything that exists, according to Aristotle, has an end, a goal, a purpose, and its life or its existence is directed towards achieving that end or goal. This is especially the case for human beings, since we are self-directed in ways that other existing things, even animals, are not. And so Aristotle says that just like everything else, the human being is aiming towards their good. He asks, then, what is this good? We have to figure out what it is, what the highest function is for the human being, what our goal is as humans. this would be sort of part of the definition of the human being, right? That a human being necessarily strives for this thing. And according to Aristotle, this highest end, this highest goal is happiness. So he says, we can know that this is the case pretty simply just by asking people why they act. And he says, eventually you will arrive at the statement, I'm doing this because I want to be happy. So maybe a sort of easy example would be something like if I were to ask you all, why are you here in this class taking ethics? Many of you would say something like, well, it's a requirement for my program. And if I asked you, why is it important to complete the requirements? You'd say, well, I want to graduate. And if I said, well, why is it important to graduate? You might say, because I want to get a good job, make some decent money, and on until eventually Aristotle thinks the only answer you would be able to give is because I want to be happy. And he would take this as an indication that, you see, happiness is the real goal. We might think about other things, but in the end, if you look deep enough, our actual goal is happiness. And this must be then an indication that happiness is good for us. Right. But he thinks, well, that gets us somewhere. Now we know we're about happiness, but we still don't really understand what happiness is. Right? He says, we have to figure out how we define happiness. The definition of happiness, he says, whatever it is, has to fit with this notion that the end or the goal for the human being has to be something which is wanted for itself, which is complete and self-sufficient, desired for its own sake, right? The sort of thing that is an endpoint. That once we achieve that, we're kind of done. We've achieved what we've set out to do. And he says, well, if you kind of survey people about what they think happiness is, what sort of life they think will lead to happiness, you get 5 possible options, right? 5 possibilities for what sort of life will be the happiest. And he says the first one, the one that most people would probably answer, is, well, I'm after pleasure. Happiness is pleasure. It's the life of gratification. Aristotle rejects this possibility because he says that pleasure, especially physical pleasure, which is how he's intending the term to be defined, is really more to do with our nature as an animal than it is to do with our nature as a human being. Right? He says even animals can have pleasure. Even animals can have various types of physical gratification. And so that must not be what it is to be truly happy as a human being. He thinks this is a kind of bestial existence, and we as human beings surely can do better than that. So he says, no, happiness, that it's not pleasure. That's not how we define it. He says another popular opinion would be that happiness is wealth, and that the life of money-making is the life that will lead to happiness. Here again, he ultimately rejects this view because he says wealth, money, is not the sort of thing that we desire for its own sake. Instead, he thinks, we only desire money because it's useful for something else. Right? We don't want money just to have it, we want it for what it can buy us, essentially. And so, if that's the case, then wealth doesn't fit this definition of happiness, especially this bit here, that it's, especially this bit here, that it's desired for its own sake. He says, no, in fact, it's desired for something else, namely the various things that you can buy. So he says, okay, those folks who want to define happiness as having wealth are wrong. The next possible answer that he thinks he would get has to do with what he calls the life of political activity. He says many people think that happiness is about living a life of political action. This is especially true in ancient Greece, where living the life of the statesman was considered especially honorable. Politicians were regarded extremely highly in ancient Greece. And so you might expect, especially for the upper classes, this would be a common answer. And he breaks this life of political activity down into two segments. The first, he says, many people focus on honor and say, well, happiness is going to be about being honored for your political service. He rejects this notion because he thinks honor is not the sort of thing that is self-sufficient. Right, so again, it doesn't fit one of these major components that are necessary for happiness. It's not self-sufficient. Because, he says, to have honor requires other people. You need people to honor you. It's not the sort of thing you can have on your own. Furthermore, he says honor is the sort of thing that you can lose easily. Excuse me. If you make a little mistake and then people stop honoring you, then you've lost your happiness. And he wants happiness to be something that's a bit more steadfast than that. So he says no, it can't be about honor. But he says there is a smaller segment of the population who says, look, really, political activity isn't about the honor that you receive, but it's about doing good. It's about being virtuous, right? The ideal politician is a person who is acting for the good of the state out of a sense that it's what they're supposed to do, out of virtue. And here he says we have hit on something that is a solid possibility, at least. So the idea is that if we are acting not for honor or for wealth or for pleasure, but out of virtue, this might be a good definition for happiness. And this is the type of life about which we are going to talk the most, because this is the type of life that has to do with moral virtue. Right? Now, to act out of a virtuous character. Once you've attained the virtuous character, is the sort of thing that is complete and self-sufficient. It is the sort of thing that you might want for itself, just to be virtuous, because being virtuous is good. It's the sort of thing that's hard to lose. You don't require other people for all of the virtues, etc. So he says this might be a good definition for happiness. But he still wants to say it's not going to be the best definition. Right. Even though it does fit some of these elements for happiness in some respects, it's not entirely unproblematic. And so he says the best definition of happiness that we can have is what he calls the life of contemplation or study. And so happiness would be defined as study, contemplation, essentially the philosophical life. We'll talk more about this next week when we talk about chapter 10. But perhaps unsurprising, coming from a philosopher, he wants to say that a philosophical life is going to be the absolute pinnacle of human happiness. To flourish as a human being, to be the best sort of human being possible, he says certainly happiness, or certainly study and contemplation can get you there, but also perhaps virtue and political activity. And that's what will be our focus. So he kind of finishes up here. Happiness is something final and self-sufficient, and it is the end or the goal of action. Right. He continues, human good turns out to be activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. And if there are more than one virtue, in accordance with the best and most complete. So this is a definition that's in accordance with the idea that happiness is about the life of political activity having to do with virtue. He says that it's an activity of the soul, so it's something that's not just an outward action, but it has to do with your soul and the sort of character, the sort of person that you are. Being a virtuous person isn't just about doing virtuous things, but actually having that virtue as a component of your soul. In order to achieve this type of happiness, Aristotle says you have to have virtue, pleasure, and external goods. You need virtue. I think we sort of covered that, and we'll talk more about the particular virtues that you need. You need pleasure in the sense that it is necessary for the virtuous person to actually take pleasure in doing virtuous actions. That's an indication that they're doing them because they're virtuous, not for some ulterior motives. And you need external goods, social position, education, money, etc. Because it's in many cases, virtue, the ability to enact virtuous actions, to live out your virtuous character is going to require those things. And also, because even before you've attained this virtuous character, the work that you have to go through to become virtuous in both education and habituation or practice are going to require some resources, right? If you are struggling to survive, you're probably not going to have a lot of time to practice being virtuous. Likewise, if you are in ancient Greece and your family doesn't have money to send you to school, it's going to be difficult for you to gain the moral education that you might need. Right? So even though pleasure and external goods, wealth, that sort of thing, are not happiness in themselves, they are sort of components to happiness. They are necessary steps along the way to actually attaining happiness. He also points out that happiness requires a complete life. The idea here is that even if you have a person whose life has been going pretty well so far, you still have the possibility that something could go wrong until they're dead. And if something horrific were to befall them, he thinks, well, you probably couldn't say that they're happy at the end of the day. And he uses Priam as an example. Priam is the famous king or ruler of Troy, the ancient city, known far and wide to be a virtuous and caring ruler. However, when his son kidnapped Helena and took her to Troy, and the Trojan War ensued, and Troy was sacked, Priam's life took a kind of turn for the worse. Despite the fact that his life up until that point had been one of virtue and happiness, at the end of the Trojan War, he was destitute, right? His children were dead, his city was sacked, and Aristotle says there's a way in which we wouldn't consider Priam happy at the end. And so he says, just to be safe, if we're evaluating the happiness of others, we have to wait until they're dead. We have to wait for a complete life to have passed so that we can look at happiness in the whole span of their life, not in any singular element of their life. So that basically covers book 1. The big sort of takeaway point there is this definition of happiness as a activity of the soul in accordance with virtue, requiring virtue, pleasure, and external goods. And to sort of have in the back of our heads that despite the fact that we're going to be focusing on virtue, there is also this idea of study and contemplation in the background for Aristotle. And so if we move on to book 2, we get some more details about the moral virtues, right? So now that we know we should be concerned about virtue, Aristotle says, well, we have to figure out what virtues we're talking about here. What are the specifics? And so he breaks down virtue into 2 types, moral virtues and intellectual virtues. Moral virtues have to do with how we should act, and they are most closely related to the life of political activity focused on virtue, as we talked about earlier. And these are also generally the result of habituation. So you attain moral virtue by practicing. For example, you attain a generous character by practicing generous actions until it becomes habit. On the other hand, you have intellectual virtues. These are virtues which are focused upon various elements of our reason. These are generally attained through education. So you learn the various intellectual virtues by being educated into them. You also have to practice in order to really solidify the virtue in yourself, but it's primarily education, whereas moral virtues are primarily habituation with some education. The most important intellectual virtue for our purposes is practical wisdom. This is the intellectual virtue that has to do with thinking rationally about morality. So we'll sort of come back to that a bit. And it's important to note that according to Aristotle, in order to be truly virtuous and thus truly moral, you have to display all of the virtues. So all 5 intellectual virtues and all 8 or 9 moral virtues. His definition here of moral virtue, we're going to focus on moral virtue, is, as he says in chapter 6 of book 2, a state of character concerned with choice lying in a mean. That is, the mean relative to us. This being determined by a rational principle, by that principle by which the man of practical wisdom would determine it. Now it is a mean between 2 vices, that which depends on excess and that which depends on defect. So the idea here is that virtue is a state of character. It's part of our character as human beings, not just actions, but actually who we are. It lies in a mean, that is a kind of middle ground between a vice of excess, doing too much of something, and a vice of deficiency, doing too little. So the idea here for Aristotle is that virtue is about finding the middle ground. And it's the middle ground relative to us. So each person will have a different middle ground. Something which might be virtuous for me might be excessive or deficient for someone else. And so now that he's given us a kind of general definition, he provides us with a list of 8 moral virtues and their corresponding vices. We'll kind of just briefly go through all 8 virtues and talk about the vices as well. So first of all, he says we have the virtue of courage. Acting despite our fear, especially in areas of military engagement for Aristotle, but we can think of it more generally as well. So he says virtue is courage, and then you have the vice of excess. If you are essentially too courageous, too fearless, you can be rash. And then if you are not courageous enough, you end up with cowardice. The virtue with respect to physical pleasure is called temperance, or sometimes just moderation. The vice, if you overindulge in your pleasures instead of being moderate, is self-indulgence. And the vice, that's the vice of excess, and the vice of deficiency, insensibility. So the idea here is that Aristotle does think it's possible to be sort of too aesthetic, right? To deny yourself too much. Instead of this over-denial, he says we should strive for a middle ground of temperance or moderation. The virtue with respect to money is generosity, also sometimes called liberality. If you are excessive in your generosity, you give away more than you can afford to or more than you should, he says, well, then you've reached the vice of excess, which is wastefulness or prodigality. But then again, if you don't give away enough, if you hoard your money too much, then you are guilty of the vice of deficiency, meanness, or stinginess. In addition, you have a virtue that has to do with pride. He calls this proper pride. And the idea here is that Aristotle thinks, despite what we might think maybe in more contemporary views where humility is highly valued, Aristotle says, no, we need to take proper pride in our abilities, in our actions, in ourselves. If we are not proud enough, we can suffer from undue humility. Right? So we shouldn't be too humble. But likewise, we shouldn't be too proud, because then we will be guilty of vanity. So instead, we have to achieve the middle ground, be honest with ourselves and take the appropriate amount of pride in ourselves and our actions. With respect to emotion, the virtue, according to Aristotle, is good-temperedness or mildness. I think the easiest way to think about this is in terms of anger. That gives us a good example, but this will work for all emotions. If we are overly emotional, we are irascible with respect to anger. This would be something like rage. But likewise, you can be not emotional enough. And this would be an unirascible, or with respect to anger, lacking proper anger. So the idea here is, overall, we ought to be mild, good-tempered, but there are times where it is appropriate to display emotion, and if you do not display those emotions, that is a vice. With respect to truth and falsity, the virtue is, probably unsurprisingly, truthfulness. But if you are too truthful, you can be sort of boastful or blunt. And if you are not truthful enough, he talks about false modesty. He seems to be talking about truthfulness, especially with respect to being truthful about oneself. But we can also think about it more generally, something just like lying. Right? So the idea here is we value truthfulness, but we don't have to be excessively truthful. There are times for Aristotle when it might be okay to tell little white lies, something like that. He also thinks that it is crucial for virtue that we be witty, the appropriate amount of funniness and humor. But if we are excessively witty, excessively funny, we can end up being a buffoon. And if we are not funny enough, if we can't take a joke, then we can end up being a bore. And finally, we have the virtue of friendliness, with respect to our actual friends, but also with respect to acquaintances. The idea here is that we ought to be, generally speaking, friendly. Not too friendly, because we end up being obsequious or being a flatterer to sort of ingratiate ourselves to others. But also, we don't want to be too unfriendly, because we will end up with being quarrelsome. So, right, if we think back to the definition, the idea here is that for each virtue, each individual will find the middle ground for them. For example, if you are a professional comedian, then the standard for you to be considered witty might be different than it is for someone who has a very serious profession, something like that, right? Aristotle's classic example has to do with temperance or moderation, and he says that what it is to be temperate for me, with respect to food intake, is going to be different than what it is to be temperate or moderate for Milo the wrestler, right? Milo is going to have to eat a lot more in order to fuel his wrestling activities than I'm going to have to eat to fuel my philosophizing, right? And so the middle ground for each person can be different. Another maybe easy example is to think about courage. What might be courageous for me might be considered cowardly for a police officer or a firefighter. Right? Whereas if I try to do what the police officer or the firefighter does, that might be rash on my part because I don't have the training or something like that. Right? So even though we have these 8 virtues that we can look to, and these 8 virtues are the same for everyone in that everyone ought to develop them, what those actually mean, what those actually look like in terms of the actions that we perform, can be drastically different for different people. So if we move on to book 3, In book 3 on action, Aristotle focuses on trying to figure out how action works. Now that we've seen kind of how virtue works, we have to figure out how we act, what it means when we act, and whether we have a choice in our actions. So he says there are 3 types of action: voluntary, involuntary, and mixed. For voluntary actions, he says these are actions that of which the moving principle is in the agent himself, he being aware of the particular circumstances of the action. So this means that these are actions where the person is physically doing the action themselves. They are in control, physically in control of their actions, and they have an understanding of the action. They understand the kind of details surrounding the action, and they take those into account when they act. He includes here, though, as voluntary actions, actions which we do when we are drunk or angry. Often we might think that we're not responsible for those. In our sort of everyday lives, if we think about these sorts of things, we often hear excuses like, oh, I didn't know what I was doing, I was drunk. Or, oh, I was so angry that I just couldn't control myself. And Aristotle does not accept that. Instead, he says, you made the decision to become impaired, either by drinking or by not learning to control your emotions. And so, you are responsible for the actions that you do when you're in those states. That ultimately those are voluntary because it was voluntary for you to get yourself into those states. On the other hand, we have involuntary actions. Involuntary actions, he says, take place under compulsion or owing to ignorance. And that is compulsory, of which the moving principle is outside, being a principle in which nothing is contributed by the person who is acting. Essentially here, involuntary actions are very limited in number. These are actions which are done because the person is literally, physically forced to do them. They are compelled by physical force. So this would be something like if someone grabbed your hand and put a gun in it and pulled the trigger for you. Right. Literal force. Not just coercion. These are also actions which are done, he says, by reason of ignorance. So when you didn't, there were some key factors to the situation of which you are not aware. For example, if you're talking with a friend and they tell you something that they mean to be a secret, but they don't tell you that it's a secret. And then you go and tell this to your other friend and they get angry. Right? Aristotle would say, well, that was an involuntary action. You were ignorant of the fact that it was supposed to be a secret. And so you can't be responsible for that. Right? He says that these are actions which are always accompanied by regret. So involuntary actions, you always regret them after the fact. You wish that you had not been forced, or you wish that you had the necessary information to act differently. If you don't regret the action, then it might as well have been voluntary for Aristotle. And so, even though we, in today's sort of everyday life, we might think about many actions as involuntary, for Aristotle, involuntary actions are very limited in number. The third type of action he calls mixed actions. These are actions which are done by people through a sense of coercion or because circumstances sort of push them in a certain way. However, there is not actual literal force, and so there is a way in which they are still freely done, right? So Aristotle says these actions are choice-worthy at the time, but not under normal circumstances. So in your everyday life, you might not choose to act the way that you do, but in these very specific circumstances, you do choose that. He says that these actions are not accompanied by regret, so this is a key difference between mixed actions and involuntary actions. You might wish that the circumstances had been different, but you don't wish that you didn't do the action because you think that at the time it was choice-worthy. Right? He thinks that mixed actions, although they're a mix between voluntary and involuntary, are more voluntary than involuntary. And this is because they are choice-worthy at the time, the person does actually choose them, they do have control. Aristotle's examples here, he says, for example, you might think about a cargo ship that gets caught in a storm. Right? And so you, the captain of the cargo ship, decide to jettison the cargo, to throw it overboard. He says, under normal circumstances, you would never throw your cargo overboard. However, under these particular circumstances, that decision is choice-worthy at the time. And you do not regret doing it because you understand that if you hadn't thrown the cargo overboard, the whole ship would have sunk. Right. Another example he gives is the example of the tyrant. He says, if a tyrant has your family, and they say something like, kill my political opponent or else I will kill your family, he says, you might choose to go ahead and kill the political opponent. You feel compelled to do that because your family's lives are at stake. However, you still do the action yourself. You are not literally forced. And so it still is your action. It still is something that you have responsibility for. Right? And so that's why it's not involuntary. It's more of a mixed action, closer to voluntary than involuntary. So the idea here is that mixed actions actually cover a lot of these sort of morally ambiguous, morally interesting actions that we might think about. Because most actions where we sort of wish things had been differently, right? We wish that the circumstances had been different than they were. We feel like we had no choice. Most of those are going to be mixed actions where we actually did have a choice. You could have allowed your family to be killed. You could have allowed the ship to sink. But you didn't. Because these actions are so morally difficult, and because there is a sense of a slight involuntary nature to them, Aristotle says we kind of decide on a case-by-case basis what to do about these, morally speaking. Sometimes people are praised, sometimes people are blamed, sometimes they're forgiven for the actions that they take in these difficult situations. But in any of these cases, he says, at the heart of these actions, there is still personal choice. The other bit that's important to talk about with respect to actions is how we actually decide to act, what the decision-making process is. And for Aristotle, he says there are essentially 4 steps. We start out with wish. He says we wish for some end, we desire some end, some goal. We can wish for anything, but only some things we can actually achieve, right? You can wish that the sky was green, but you can't do anything about that. Or you can wish to be virtuous, and you can do some things about that. Right? So you wish for some goal. He says this is always going to be the good or the apparent good. We wish for something that is actually good or that we think is good. And then once we have this goal in mind, we deliberate about it. We think about how we can achieve our goal, the means by which we can achieve our desired end. Sometimes we come up with only one way, sometimes we come up with many. Ideally, this deliberative process is done using practical wisdom, the intellectual virtue that has to do with making moral decisions, right? It's a rational, logical, careful kind of deliberation. So we deliberate, we figure out all the different ways in which we might achieve our goal. And then we make a decision. We decide which path to take. Excuse me. Which way is going to be the best, which is going to help us to achieve the goal quickest, most easily, most morally, etc. Once we make this decision about which path to take, finally we act. We actually take those steps to achieve the goal. Aristotle thinks that we are responsible for the actions that result from this process, whether they are virtuous or vicious. Right? So he says that both virtue and vice are voluntary. We choose to be moral or immoral. And that's going to do it for this week. Next week, we will continue on here with book 7, Types of Moral Failing. Now that we have a good picture of how morality is supposed to work, next week we'll see kind of where things can go wrong.